Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Durop. While many DMs use random encounters in their D&D games, very seldom do we think about what should actually go into a random table, or how and why we should use them as a storytelling aid. And it's not our fault. We typically learn random encounter design from video games, because we perceive them as the status quo. Unfortunately, these video game encounters are too often focused on reinforcing a dopamine-rushing game loop instead of driving a narrative forward, but D&D is not a video game. Therefore, random tables should be designed with a different purpose, to provide you with improvisational prompts and apply pressure to characters. What you put into your random tables will come out. That might sound extremely obvious to say, but failing to understand this fundamental aspect of random encounter design is what most often leads to random encounters feeling like low-stakes impediments to fun. While I've got an entire video discussing strategies for creating interesting tables themselves, what I failed to touch on in that video was the thought process of what exactly to put in your tables, and why you should put those things in them. Most Dungeon Masters will flesh out a table on a 2d6 bell curve, with encounters of varying rarity, like a pack of wolves, a group of bandits, and maybe dragons and medusas in the rare slots. However, the problem with only fleshing out your encounter tables with monsters found in its representative biome is that those kinds of entries do little to reflect the story being told in your current or adjacent storylines. In essence, when the encounters on your random tables do nothing to help drive your story forward, they operate as the opposite of Chekhov's gun. They foreshadow nothing useful to your players about what's happening elsewhere in the world. While your random tables likely should have a few biome-styled encounters, so too should your entries inform players about dangers elsewhere in the region. By drawing inspiration from your current storyline or ongoing story beats happening in the background, your random encounter table will perform an entirely different job than distracting players from traveling to the next quest location. Rather, players will catch wind of other issues happening elsewhere in the game world, and it will work to provide them with a deluge of quest prompts to follow up on. If a band of orcs have taken over a lycanthropy-inducing shrine in the middle of the forest, the displaced elven priests from that shrine, who might be werewolves themselves, is a great foreshadowing encounter. With a half a dozen of these narrative-reinforcing entries added to your table, your random encounters will expose your players organically to the stuff that matters for your story beats, and will leave them asking questions. In essence, players will get to taste the various problems brewing around the region. With a deeper understanding of this design philosophy, you'll seldom run a lackluster encounter of 3d6 wolves who serve no storytelling purpose ever again. Encounters should feel different for your players depending on whether they're traveling over land or are underground in a dungeon. And that's because encounters in these locations serve different purposes. In detail, checking for random encounters while the party is over land might only happen once a day, or even less frequently. Therefore, due to the low frequency of them, players feel comfortable resting early and often if an encounter results in combat. So it only makes sense that combat would erupt only if the NPCs believe they can actually win the fight or are testing the PC's general strength to run away and inform a story-relevant NPC. Otherwise, the encounter would be entirely social. Monsters with any kind of intelligence aren't going to throw themselves onto the sword. If characters bump into a thief from a nearby town, that thief isn't going to attack the entire party. Instead, they will likely follow the players, offering polite conversation and information about the region, and hoist a bag of gems off of one of the player characters before taking an opposite route in the fork in the road. With that said, random encounters don't have to be creatures. Adding a table entry for a randomly generated shrine, cairn, tomb, or shack, as well as its contents, is a great way to reward players for meandering off of the beaten path. These physical locations grant players a safer place to rest, as well as occasionally offering up interesting treasure. Further, to tie these small physical locations back to the main story somewhat, rolling on the random table a second time can reveal who or what the players find at the physical location, or at least the remnants of that creature's presence. Broken toys, a torched thatch roof cottage, and a dozen hoof trails encircling a small farmstead goes a long way to telegraph the presence of raiders. With all that said, overland random encounters should offer information and occasionally high-stakes danger when appropriate. Monsters are easy to put into your random encounter tables, but deciding on what kinds of random attributes to add to discovered physical locations can be difficult since we aren't practiced in that sort of thinking. Fortunately, this video's sponsor, Describe, is a great source of inspiration. Check out this ruined arena encounter location. All of these ideas, like the decaying columns, the smashed statues, or even the bloody sandpit, are all interesting things you can add to a random encounter table of your own. Mixing and matching from various environmental maps like this pool of blessings can inspire perhaps a flooded amphitheater decorated with smashed statues. For more random environment encounter inspiration, check out the link in the description and use the coupon code BARON when you sign up. Thanks to Scribe for sponsoring this video. Random encounters inside the confines of dungeon walls will serve a very different purpose than the story-reinforcing elements of overland encounters. In fact, just about every random encounter design paradigm used in the overworld can be turned on its head. A dungeon is a consistently threatening biome where danger lurks around every corner. While players traversing over land might only experience random encounters once per day, or even less frequently, those same characters in any given dungeon might risk a random encounter as often as every 10 minutes. Most poignantly here, without the pressure of random wandering monsters within a dungeon, players will feel as safe as they do above ground. That safety encourages players to rest back to full health after every pre-planned combat or trap encounter. This behavior reduces the threat of the dungeon itself. However, when players know that taking a short rest would mean that they suffer perhaps a 1 in 6 chance of more skeletons or oozes coming to look for them, they won't be so keen to spontaneously rest without forethought. What's more, these subterranean encounters can be designed to apply pressure to the character resources and disrupt rest, instead of focusing on threatening lives as the encounters do above ground. While dungeon random encounters are welcome to reflect the larger story occurring within the confines of the dungeon walls, their function also serves this wholly different purpose. All that said, some dungeons are just not going to be large enough to warrant such random encounter tables, but the larger the dungeon gets, especially in excess of a dozen rooms, the dungeon should truly come alive with various threats. In essence, remember that random encounters are tools to teach your players about what is going on in the game world in an organic way, as well as a means to apply pressure to dangerous situations. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.